So maybe the most common question we get in the Klee community is, people will come in and ask, what happens when we get Hydra applications strong enough for Klee to consistently vape? Whether it's a new character or whether it's like 2 different supports. Will that make her meta? Will it make Klee vape meta? As many of you already know, Klee already has enough Hydra application with C6 and Cho. She can already vape consistently if you know what you're doing. Now, this topic is already covered in the KQM guide. I wrote it down here, so if you wanted to see a little rundown of it, it'll be here. But essentially what it comes down to is Klee isn't really like a lot of other characters. She's like, if you take Xiangling, Pyro is known for not having ICD, but it's not only just that. Is after Gobo disappears, pretty much all her damage is coming from Pyronado. If you look at Hu Tao, she does her normal and charge attack combos. Now obviously not all her normal attacks vape. There's a significant amount of her damage is coming from the charge attacks and her burst, and all these attacks are separate, one at a time. She does a normal attack, she does charge attacks, and then before her E expires she'll do her burst. Similar thing with D-Luke. Similar thing, not all his normal attacks will vape, but he has his E's which all vape, and he will have his burst, and again he does these all one at a time. Essentially what it comes down to is Klee isn't really like these characters that I've got down here: Hu Tao, D-Luke, Xiangling, Bennett, even someone like Rosario as well. Essentially all these characters do like one sort of attack at a time, and you could even see how Hu Tao, her charge attacks have no ICD. D-Luke's, his element of skill has no ICD. Xiangling, Pyronado has no ICD. So what this means is they have a really significant portion of their overall damage contribution. A significant portion of that is able to be reacted with. Now, on the other hand, if you look at Klee, she is similar to Hu Tao in that she'll have a normal attack and charge attack combos, but she'll also have her mines going off at the same time, and she'll also have her burst going off constantly. Now, it's a similar thing with Childe. He's got his normal and charge attacks, and he's got his riptides going off constantly, and that is applying a lot of Hydra application, similar to how Klee is applying a lot of Pyro application. And now this is something that we actually calculated. Klee's whole damage contribution is quite evenly split between all 3 talents. So you can say like 30% for each. So what does this all mean? Essentially, it means for these characters like Klee and Childe, which we call enablers in the community, what it means is that these characters aren't getting that much of an overall multiplier from app reactions, and people already know this for Childe. As I say in the guide, there are a minority amount of people trying to forward vape Childe's attacks. It's like a Sunfire team, and there are people looking forward to playing him in those roles. But the thing is, with Childe, people have already realized that he's more beneficial as an enabler, and it is not just because people think that his damage is lower than in Xiangling, so it's better for her to utilize the reactions. It's even that he can't really benefit from that. He does a lot of little smaller hits similar to Klee. They do a bunch of smaller hits that add up to a bigger overall value, but that is something that you can't maximize well by amplifying a third of that damage, by 50% or 100% if it's Childe. So with Klee, even if you're able to get perfect Hydra application and she's constantly vaporizing, as we mentioned, her talents are pretty evenly spread, so essentially you're only ever going to get a third of her damage vaping, and you're putting all this effort into building a team around it. Now in comparison, putting aside how just Monopyro just plays a lot better and just does a lot more damage, one of the reasons why it's more effective is that you're adding a multiplier to all of Klee's damage, 100% of her damage. You're not adding a vape multiplier, it's not multiplying by 1.5, but you're adding smaller things like Xiangling's C1 and a Constellation 6 and Kazua's buffs. And all these smaller multipliers you're actually getting more value or the same value. And then on top of that, just you're getting better supports, you're getting more flexibility, you're getting these supports who are benefiting off of Klee, who are even dealing AoE damage instead of single target damage with Xingqiu. And a similar thing with Childe, instead of boxing him into forward vaping, you're putting him in an enabler team where he's doing a lot of damage, he's vaping his burst, but then you're also getting a lot of AoE damage from Xiangling, and it's just overall more value. Now on the flip side, similarly to Klee but far more understood is Ayaka. People understand not to play her in melt. Due to ICD, you're only melting a third of your burst, but you're also building your entire team around this 1.5 times multiplier. Well, actually, Ayaka's technically in a better position than Klee, because instead of doing this, it's pretty obvious you can just use Blizzard Strayer and freeze teams and get a ton of crit rate. And even in mono cryo teams, you can still get 35% crit rate and a ton of team buffs. At the end of the day, people understand this is clearly all more valuable than just a melt multiplier, and you can get a much more synergistic team on top of it. But the question is it the player's fault? Is it the player's fault for not playing Klee as much as other characters? Is it the player's fault for misunderstanding Childe for the longest time, for thinking he doesn't do any damage? Or it's actually just Hoyoverse's fault? And it could be their fault that they're not making things easy for players to understand, they're not simplifying things, their tutorials are not good enough. If you look at things like ICD, application rates, characters, roles and where they sort of fit, a lot of that is pretty much just left up to the community to figure out. If you look at Genshin's tutorials, they're just you're pretty much just thrown in and you play around the character, and it works because Genshin is a casual game, but my point is it doesn't really teach players how Hoyoverse might have intended these characters to play. Whereas in comparison, if you look at Honkai, obviously that's more of a PvP game. However, they are explaining exactly how a character works. They're giving you an example team, they're giving you an example of rotation. So it's a lot more easier to understand what the developer intended. So overall, is it really the community's fault that they didn't really understand how Klee was intended to be played, how Childe was intended to be played? No, I'm not really sure. At this point in the game, Dendro isn't out, there aren't many characters for Klee to enable at the moment. So if you look at Genshin is pretty heavily focused based around reactions. So if a character comes out, and this character came out in 1.0, if a character came out and so far in the game, at least pre-Dendro, they've been intended to be played in Pyro only teams, Pyro focused teams without reactions, and the tutorial system isn't good enough to explain that might be the case for certain characters, then I'm not sure it's the community's fault. Now interestingly, we can actually see this disconnect with Raiden Shogun, and if you look at some of the press material that Hoyoverse put out on HoyoLab during her release, you can see here they are claiming that she is a support character who can enhance her party's elemental burst damage. Now obviously that is technically true, but there is a clear disconnect between what they're saying here versus what people are actually playing, and whether that's something that Hoyoverse intended. You can see that something has gone wrong in this material, and this might be even funnier, but you can see a similar situation with their press material for Ayaka. You can see here they're calling her a sustained damage dealer, and we know that's really not the case at all. So if we look at a character like Xiangling, now obviously there are certain things which I don't think the developers intended, like snapshotting or exactly how much damage she was going to do, but it's pretty clear that she was designed as an off-field damage dealer that was going to do some sort of reactions, and you can see her ascension stat is elemental mastery. So this is why you could say that Xiangling was intended to be played with a character like Xingqiu, with characters like Fischl, or even later on characters like Raiden. Yet at the same time, she has constellations like a Constellation 1, which will reduce Pyro res. She has a Constellation 6, which she can't actually benefit from herself, but that boosts Pyro damage. This also implies that she was meant to be played alongside Pyro damage dealers. And now if we look at Klee's kit, she generates a lot of Pyro energy with her skill and also with her talent. And she causes a lot of chaos, so appreciates off-field damage dealers that can move around with her. So if you put 2 and 2 together, you could say that Childe was intended to be played with Xiangling for reactions, but also Klee was intended to be played alongside Xiangling and just dealing pure Pyro damage. Now, as I mentioned, with Dendro a lot of things can change. It is pretty clear that some sort of things are going to go on with burning, and even with Childe a lot of things could be happening with Hydro Dendro reactions. Pretty much all of this to say that I do hope when Dendro comes out there is a little bit more explanations by Hoyoverse, and the tutorials are better, although I'm not getting my hopes up. Just overall, I don't think the developers should be expecting casual or hardcore players to be figuring everything out themselves, and hopefully we can see some improvements on this in the future. And just to answer the original question, if it wasn't obvious already, Klee doesn't need Hydro to be good. And as far as meta goes, it depends on your definition. I don't know if she's ever going to be one of the most popular characters in the game, but if your definition of meta is about damage, she already has that. Mono Pyro teams already do a lot of damage, and there may be burning teams in the future. You know, as this whole video was about, not every character needs that 1.5 multiplier in their teams. You know, it's just a multiplier at the end of the day. You can get multipliers from various different buffs in the game. So what's the point of this? Am I saying that Genshin needs to be more like Honkai, a PvP sort of game? Not really, but I think Hoyoverse needs to get across their design intentions, and I think the in-game tutorials are something they really need to work on. And I think these in-game tutorials are somewhere where they could be doing this a lot better, and they can get a little bit of inspiration from how they're doing things with Honkai, and they can explain a bit more about what they're intending for these characters, and just some basic ideas on how these characters can play, rather than how they're doing it now, where they're just slapping us in an instance and you're just messing around with a random support character that may or may not actually have any relevance towards them. You see, a common complaint that early players had with Klee is they find her clunky, they found her difficult to manage stamina, they found it difficult to vape with her. And the thing is, whilst a lot of these issues are valid, it turns out they were only valid because they were trying to play Klee as she was not intended to be played, as she was not optimized to be played for. And this is something that a lot of us veteran Klee players have realized. She doesn't have clunkiness issues if you don't have to vape Xingqiu's rain swords with her. She doesn't have stamina problems if Kazuha is giving a stamina reduction, or even more importantly, if she isn't required to stay on the field for a significant portion of your rotations. And similarly, she also doesn't necessarily need a shield if she's playing in this sort of quick swap playstyle. So when you don't have those problems by playing her in a more synergistic team, in a more synergistic role, things start to make a lot more sense. But it did take a while to get to this point. Like I said, people are still asking about Klee Vape. That is still not common knowledge, although Mono Pyro is one of the better teams in the game at the moment. So why is there still confusion? Why are both casual players and hardcore players still having these misunderstandings? Maybe the in-game direction could be improved.